For 1,000 years, the galaxy had known nothing but peace. The wars of the past, once filled with fire and steel, had become myths told in classrooms, distant echoes that children barely believed. Humanity had spread to hundreds of worlds, built cities under alien suns, and carved shining habitats around stars. They grew rich, they grew curious, and they grew soft. Conflict was studied only by historians. Warships were dismantled or turned into museums where school groups would stare at their rusted cannons and wonder how anyone could have lived in such brutal times. Generations passed and the word war became a relic, a joke, something as far away as dragons and magic. Peace was all they knew. It ended in a single moment. Across every colony, on every ship, and on every planet, the stars were suddenly filled with a voice. It hissed and roared through every channel, interrupting broadcasts, drowning music and chatter. The voice was alien, filled with a strange clicking undertone that made human skin crawl. Its words were translated instantly by automated systems, and the message was clear. Humans of soul, your 1,000 years of weakness ends today. We are the Valix. We declare war. We will burn your worlds. You will kneel beneath us. The silence that followed was heavy. In the high towers of Earth's capital, leaders stared at each other in disbelief. On distant colonies like Nova Centauri, workers paused in their minds and gazed up at the skies. On Luna, children turned to their teachers with wide eyes and asked what war meant. The old records had not prepared them for this, and then something strange happened. Humanity laughed. The first chuckles came from the young, who thought the voice was part of some strange performance, a prank streaming across the galaxy. Soon entire groups were bent over with laughter, mocking the insect-like hiss of the alien speaker. Jokes spread faster than fear. War? What's that, a new game? Someone quipped on the interlink. A comedian on Mars went viral for holding up a loaf of bread and saying, "If war tastes like this, count me in." Within hours, the alien broadcast was turned into songs, animations, and comedy skits. Memes of armored bugs demanding tribute flooded every screen. For most of the galaxy's humans, the threat was nothing more than entertainment. How could something so ancient, so absurd, be real? War was not a word that carried weight anymore. It was a punchline. But in the quiet corners of space, there were some who did not laugh. On Earth, deep below the mountains, a few men and women still kept the old records alive. In forgotten stations orbiting the moons of Jupiter, rusting ships slept in silence, their cannons covered in dust, their reactors cold. On Mars, in a museum that children often visited, the last warship of humankind sat tethered in orbit, its steel belly hollow but its bones strong. To most, these things were relics, curiosities of another age. But to a very small few, they were reminders, because humanity might have forgotten war, but war had never forgotten humanity. And while billions laughed at the hissing threat of the Valix, while colonies made light of the alien promise of fire, somewhere out there the first shadows were already moving. The peace that had lasted 1,000 years was broken, and in the silence after the laughter, the universe began to hold its breath. Far above the red sands of Mars, a lonely shape drifted in orbit, its shadow stretching across the stars. It was called the Resolute, the last of humanity's warships. Once it had roared through battles with cannons blazing and engines burning white, but now it was nothing more than a hollow museum. Children walked its halls during field trips, running their hands over cold steel and giggling at the sight of antique weapons. Guides told stories of ancient wars, and tourists marveled at the scale of the ship, shaking their heads as if war itself was too strange to ever be real again. Most people left with smiles, grateful they lived in gentler times. But Captain Elena Drake never smiled when she stood inside the Resolute. Elena was not a young woman, but she carried herself with the sharpness of a blade. She was one of the last trained officers of the ancient defense academies, a place where dusty strategies were still taught, even though no one truly believed they would be used again. To many, she seemed like a relic, a soldier without a war, a commander without an army. She spent her days in silence aboard the museum ship, studying its engines, running her hands across the consoles, whispering to herself about tactics and maneuvers no one cared to remember. When the message of the Valix thundered across the galaxy, Elena was ready in a way others were not. While billions laughed, while leaders called for peace talks and tried to calm the public, she felt the cold weight of truth press against her heart. The Valix were not playing games. They had declared war, and they meant every word. Humanity, blind and foolish, had forgotten how real such a thing could be. She knew it would fall to people like her to carry the burden once more. The summons came quickly. She was called to a hidden chamber on Mars, beneath the ancient canyons carved by forgotten rivers. There, in a quiet hall lit by pale lamps, sat the Council of Veterans. They were old, older than most believed possible. Their hair white, their faces lined, their bodies weakened by time. Yet their eyes burned with the fire of memory. They had studied the old wars, kept the secrets alive, guarded the ancient plans when no one else cared to. They looked at her with the weight of centuries pressing down. "Elena Drake," said the eldest, his voice cracked but strong. "The galaxy has forgotten, but we have not. The Valix will not stop. They will not reason. They will not forgive. They only know conquest. And so it falls to us. And to you." Elena bowed her head. "You want me to command the Resolute?" The old man nodded slowly. "The ship has slept long enough. Wake her, lead her, remind the stars what humanity once was." For a long moment, Elena said nothing. She thought of the young who laughed at the word war, of the colonies who turned the Valix threat into a joke. She thought of how unprepared they were, how soft they had become, and then she smiled, not with joy but with a fierce hunger that burned like fire. "About time," she said. The veterans rose as one, frail bodies trembling but proud, and gave her their blessing. Soon the shipyards of Mars thundered with life. Engineers swarmed over the old vessel, brushing away centuries of dust, waking systems that had not felt power in 1,000 years. The cannons hummed. Reactors roared back to life, and steel groaned as if the ship itself remembered. Lights flickered across the command bridge, and consoles came alive with glowing symbols. The Resolute, the old warrior of humanity, breathed once more. And though the colonies still laughed, though billions still treated the Valix as nothing more than a strange joke, a new sound began to echo quietly across the void. The sound of engines waking, the sound of war returning, the sound of humanity sharpening its teeth. Elena Drake stood on the bridge, her eyes hard as stone, and whispered into the silence, "Let them come." The skies above Titan darkened as the first wave of Valix ships arrived. They came like a storm, 1,000 black shapes sliding through the void, their long needle bodies glittering with alien light. Each ship pulsed with energy, weapons glowing like blue fireflies in the darkness. They moved with terrifying speed, forming vast swarms that blotted out the stars, and for the first time in 1,000 years, humanity saw what a true invasion looked like. Titan's colonies, built on ice plains beneath protective domes, panicked as alarms wailed. Families rushed through streets lit by red warning lights, clutching children to their chests as evacuation shuttles filled. Workers abandoned mining drills, scientists fled their observatories, and all eyes turned to the sky as the swarm of enemies descended. The Valix had chosen Titan as their first target, a jewel of Saturn, and they came with one clear goal: to burn it. Above the chaos, a single massive shape drifted into orbit, engines rumbling with ancient power. The Resolute had awakened. The old warship, scarred by time, now gleamed as its steel skin caught the light of Saturn's rings. Inside its bridge, Captain Elena Drake stood tall, her hands gripping the command rail as she studied the swarm. Around her, the crew trembled with nervous energy. Most of them had never seen combat. They were young, engineers, historians, technicians, people who had studied ships as artifacts, not weapons. Some looked pale, others gripped their consoles too tightly, their breaths coming fast. A few older veterans moved among them, steadying voices, reminding them to breathe, reminding them to trust their captain. "Captain," the helmsman whispered, his voice almost breaking. "They outnumber us 100 to 1. What do we do?" Elena's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a sharp grin. "We fight," she said simply. "And we win." Perfect odds, the swarm attacked. The first wave of plasma bolts streaked through the darkness, burning bright trails as they slammed into Titan's defense satellites, shattering them into molten shards. Human stations exploded, fragments scattering across the void. The Valix moved with machine-like precision, their weapons tearing through anything that dared resist. But then the Resolute roared, its cannons lit up like thunder. Railguns fired with bone-rattling force, launching metal slugs faster than light. Beams of energy carved through alien armor, ripping ships apart in bursts of fire. The old ship moved like a predator, its engines flaring as Elena barked orders with sharp precision. "Helm starboard roll. Gunners fire broadside." The warship swung with surprising grace, unleashing a storm of death into the swarm. Enemy vessels shattered, their pieces tumbling through space like broken glass. The crew shouted in shock as they saw alien ships fall before them. The young who had trembled moments ago now cried out with exhilaration. Fear gave way to something fiercer: pride, fury, and the strange fire that humanity had always carried in its bones. The Valix screamed across their channels, their voices shrill and furious. "Impossible! Humans should not know war. You have forgotten. You are weak." But still the human ship fought, and still it tore holes through the swarm. Elena stood like a statue of iron, her voice steady as she commanded the chaos, her eyes never leaving the stars before her. The battle raged for hours. Titan's surface burned as stray fire rained down, but the colonies held. Evacuation ships escaped under the cover of the Resolute's guns. Every time the aliens tried to push through, Elena outmaneuvered them, using old tactics they had never seen before: feints, ambushes, sudden bursts of speed. Humanity had forgotten war, yes, but the Valix had never faced humanity in war. That was their mistake. When at last the swarm broke apart and fled, leaving behind wreckage and the silence of defeat, the stars above Titan were littered with burning ships. Humanity had won its first battle in 1,000 years. The crew cheered, tears in their eyes, their voices echoing across the ship. But across the colonies, when the news spread, laughter followed once again. Billions watched the broadcast of alien ships exploding and declared it the greatest joke of all. The bugs had come to crush them, and instead they were crushed. Yet Elena knew better. She stood on her bridge, staring at the empty black where the Valix had fled, her jaw tight. "This is only the beginning," she whispered. And in the silence of the stars, the Resolute prepared for the war yet to come. The fires of Titan still burned when silence fell across the battlefield. The wreckage of alien ships drifted like broken bones through the void, glowing faintly in Saturn's light. The Resolute floated among the ruins, scarred and weary, its hull pitted with burns, its armor torn open in places where enemy fire had cut too deep. Inside the ship, the crew moved slowly, their eyes wide and hollow. The thrill of victory had faded, replaced by the heavy truth of war. For the first time in their lives, most of them had seen death up close: the sight of shattered colonies below, the screams of civilians during the evacuation, the smell of smoke that clung even to the recycled air of the ship, all of it pressed down like a weight too heavy to bear. In the engineering bay, a young mechanic sat against the wall, his face pale and his hands trembling. He was barely 20, a boy who had only ever studied machines as puzzles and toys. Now he stared at his blood-stained gloves, the memory of dragging a wounded comrade from a burning corridor carved deep into his mind. "We laughed," he whispered, his voice shaking. "Everyone laughed. But this is real. People are dying." His words hung in the air like a confession of guilt. Captain Elena Drake crouched beside him, her gaze steady, her voice calm. She rested a hand on his shoulder, firm but gentle. "Yes," she said softly. "It's real. And it's terrible. But that's why we fight. Humanity laughs at fear because laughter keeps us standing. But we never laugh at sacrifice. We honor it." Her words sank into him like steel, and though his hand still trembled, the boy nodded. Throughout the colonies, the battle had shaken the illusion of safety. The jokes and laughter still spread, but beneath them something older stirred. On Earth, leaders who had once dismissed the Valix as a passing storm now held emergency councils. On Mars, ancient shipyards were reopened, their gates unlocking after centuries of silence. On Europa, miners volunteered to be soldiers, their tools soon to become weapons. Across the galaxy, a strange transformation began. The softness of peace started to harden into the steel of defiance. Humanity was remembering, yet the Valix were not broken. Their first assault had been driven back, but more fleets gathered in the darkness. Reports arrived of new swarms forming on the edge of known space, countless ships preparing to strike again. They were not just an invading army. They were an empire of conquerors who had swept across the stars for ages, enslaving or destroying every race that resisted. To them, humanity was not special. It was simply the next meal. Inside the Resolute, Elena gathered her crew. They stood in the command hall, faces lit by the dim glow of consoles, the silence thick with unspoken fear. She looked at each of them, young and old, weary and scarred. Some were ready to run, others ready to fight, and many simply did not know what to believe. Her voice cut through the silence like a blade. "The Valix will come again. Stronger, fiercer, more relentless than before. And when they do, we will meet them. We will not hide and we will not bow. We are human. We bleed, but we endure. We grieve, but we rise. And when the enemy thinks we are broken, we remind them what it means to face us. The words lit something in the crew, a fire that pushed back the shadows of fear. Heads lifted, shoulders straightened. The boy in engineering clenched his fists and raised his chin. They had seen the horror of war, but they had also seen victory. And in that balance of grief and triumph, humanity found its strength. Far out in the black of space, alien fleets gathered like storm clouds, endless and hungry. But on Titan's scarred surface, in the shipyards of Mars, in the hearts of men and women who had never imagined themselves as warriors, the spark of resistance grew brighter. Humanity had remembered what it meant to fight. The 1,000-year peace was dead, and in its place something fierce and unbreakable had been born. The war came at last to Sol, the heart of humanity, where Earth shone blue and bright beneath the light of its star. For days the skies had been restless with movement, fleets gathering from every corner of the colonies. Ships long buried in shipyards rose again, their hulls reforged, their engines rekindled. Civilian vessels were refitted for battle, cargo haulers turned into gun platforms, mining rigs armed with railguns. People from every world came home to defend their cradle, farmers, engineers, scientists, and dreamers, all willing to fight for the world that had given them life. Above Earth, the orbit swarmed with steel, a human armada greater than anything seen in 1,000 years. And then the darkness came. The Valix arrived like a tide of black fire, their fleet stretching across the heavens until the stars themselves vanished. 1,000 alien warships cut through the void, each bristling with weapons that glowed like shards of lightning. Their engines pulsed with an unnatural rhythm, and their voices filled the comms, shrill and cruel. Humans kneel. Your time is over. On the bridge of the Resolute, Captain Elena Drake stood tall, her gaze fixed on the endless swarm that blotted out the night. Around her, the crew braced for the storm, their hands trembling as they clutched controls, their breaths heavy in the silence before battle. She could see fear in their eyes, but also something stronger. They knew there was no running now. This was the fight that would decide if humanity lived or vanished into the cold of history. Elena's voice broke the silence, steady and sharp as steel. This is it. If we fall here, humanity falls with us, so we do not fall. The Valix struck first. Plasma storms screamed across the void, slicing through the black with searing light. The human defenses shuddered under the impact, stations cracking, satellites breaking apart. Ships erupted into fire, their fragments scattering like sparks in the wind. But the human armada did not scatter. It roared. Cannons thundered, railguns spat fire, missiles streaked through the darkness in burning arcs. Swarms of fighters broke from their carriers, weaving among the alien fleet with reckless speed. And through it all, the Resolute led the charge, its ancient hull roaring back to life like a beast from legend. The battle was chaos. Moons shook under bombardment, their surfaces cracking as fire rained down. Asteroids spun out of orbit, glowing from the heat of weapons fire. The void itself seemed alive with the clash of steel and energy. Ships collided in desperate gambits, crews choosing to ram their enemies when their guns failed. The airwaves filled with cries, with orders shouted through static, with the defiance of a species refusing to die. At the center of it all, Elena faced the Valix commander across the comms. The alien loomed on the screen, its insect face glistening, its eyes like pools of frozen blue flame. Its voice hissed through the bridge, filled with scorn. You humans are fools. You laugh in the face of death. You should fear us. Elena leaned forward, her eyes burning with fire, her lips curling into a sharp smile. Fear belongs to the dead, she said. And we are still alive. With that, she gave the order. The Resolute drove forward, its cannons blazing, cutting a burning path through the enemy swarm. The alien flagship rose to meet them, a monstrous vessel towering over the battlefield, its weapons glowing like suns. The two giants collided in a storm of fire, broadside against broadside, cannon against cannon. Elena's voice rang out over the chaos. All power to the engines. Ram them! The ship surged forward, its steel body groaning, its crew holding their breath as the distance closed. The collision was like the birth of a star. Fire erupted, light blinding, soundless shockwaves ripping across the void. The Resolute's guns fired point-blank into the alien core, tearing it apart from within. The Valix flagship shattered, its burning remains scattering into the black like sparks from a dying flame. The explosion lit Sol's skies brighter than the sun itself, a beacon for every human watching below. When the light of the explosion faded, the battlefield around Sol lay in silence. The wreckage of the Valix fleet drifted across the void, their once proud warships reduced to broken shells scattered among the stars. Smoke and fire still trailed from human vessels, and many ships were gone, torn apart in the fury of the fight, but Earth still shone below, untouched, alive. Humanity had stood on the edge of extinction and had not fallen. Across the surviving ships, cheers and cries of relief erupted. Messages flooded the comms, families calling loved ones, soldiers weeping with joy, voices rising together in disbelief that they had endured what seemed impossible. The Valix, who had come with the promise of conquest, who had boasted that humans were weak and unworthy, had been driven back. For the first time in their long reign of terror, the conquerors had been broken. In the heart of the galaxy, the news spread faster than light. Civilizations that had lived for centuries under Valix chains heard the word. Humanity had fought and won. Across distant stars, whispers grew into shouts of rebellion. Slaves rose from their knees. Rebels lit their torches, and the empire that had never been defeated began to tremble. For the Valix, it was more than defeat. It was a wound to their pride, one that would never heal. For the galaxy, it was a spark of hope. On the battered bridge of the Resolute, Elena Drake stood among her crew. The great ship was torn and scarred, its decks dark in places where power had failed, its walls marked with burns and holes, yet it still lived. The crew moved slowly, bandaged and bruised, some leaning on each other for strength, others mourning the friends they had lost. Their eyes were tired, but they shone with something fierce, the knowledge that they had done the impossible. Elena's uniform was scorched, her hair tangled, her hands scraped with blood, but she stood straight as ever. She looked out across the stars, her face solemn, her voice steady. "We forgot war," she said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else. "But war never forgot us, and now the galaxy knows we are not weak. We are human." Her words carried through the ship, through the comms, through every station and colony that listened. People raised glasses, lifted hands, embraced strangers, and shouted together in defiance and joy. It was not the clean cheer of children laughing at a joke, but the raw, thunderous roar of a species that had survived the fire. Across Earth's cities, bells rang, lights blazed, and voices rose into the night sky. On Mars, miners lit great fires in the canyons, their smoke rising into the stars. On Titan, survivors stood together on the frozen plains, staring upward at the sky where the last sparks of the battle still burned. Humanity had not only survived, they had risen, and the galaxy would never forget it. The Valix were not gone forever. They would return with new fleets, with new fury, with vengeance burning in their hearts. Elena knew this as surely as she knew her own name. But it no longer mattered. For now the balance had changed. Humanity had faced the storm and had not broken. They had shown the galaxy their spirit, their defiance, their refusal to bow. And even when death itself came roaring across the stars, they had laughed in its face. As the wreckage drifted and the silence of space closed around the battered ships, Elena raised a glass of water, the only drink left unspilled on the bridge. Around her, the crew followed, their voices low at first, then rising. "To humanity," she said, and the word thundered back to her, not only from her crew but from 1,000 voices across 1,000 worlds. To humanity. And in that moment, as cheers rolled across the stars, the galaxy knew something it had not known for 1,000 years. Humanity was no longer the peaceful race of dreamers who had forgotten war. They were the storm, the fire, the unbroken heart that laughed even as the darkness closed in, and the Valix and every race that might threaten them would never forget it again.